Welcome back to the show with Professors Michael Mayer and Professor Mehrdad Kia. Professor Mayer is a professor emeritus of the University of Montana. He took his doctorate from Princeton in 1984 and is an expert in modern American history. After nearly 4 decades of teaching, Professor Mayer retired in 2022 from the University of Montana, where he taught modern American history, intellectual history, the history of American law, and the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. He is the author of several books on these topics, including multiple textbooks and several works on the 1950s and the Eisenhower Presidency. Professor Mehrdad Kia is an active professor at the University of Montana, where he sits as the director of the Department of Central and Southwest Asian Studies. Professor Kia earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1986. He teaches an impressive variety and range of courses on modern Iran, modern and classic Islamic civilization, the Silk Road, and the intellectual history of nationalism and revolution in the Middle East. Professor Kia is the author of numerous books covering the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, the history of authoritarianism in the Middle East, and the intellectual history of Kurdish nationalism. And you may find links to Professor Kia and Professor Mayer's books in the description below. Professor Mayer and Professor Kia also have a popular radio show which airs every first Tuesday and third Monday of each month from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Missoula's local KGVO radio station, and you may find links to the KGVO website and app in the description below also. And today we have a very special episode, as we are here to discuss Professor Kia's latest book, The Clash of Empires and the Rise of Kurdish Proto-Nationalism, 1905 to 1926, published by Palgrave, Macmillan. And moreover, Professor Mayer played an important role in reviewing the drafts for this book, and it was his idea to convene this podcast in order to discuss and shamelessly promote Professor Kia's new book. And
I'm shameless of that. He's a little more.
Well, it is an honor and privilege to be a part of that cunning plan. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to Professor Mayer to start what will surely be a fascinating and stimulating discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks for having us. We appreciate it. Thinking about this book, I recall a conversation months and months and months ago with Mehrdad, during which he said he'd been doing some research into an early 20th century Kurdish leader named Simko, and he was saying that Kurdish nationalists wanted to make him a hero of Kurdish nationalism. Others had a very different view, that he was a bandit, a violent warlord. And Mehrdad said he thought he had enough for an article. And over the following weeks and months, as we talked about the prospect, it became evident that Simcoe's story touched on major issues that shaped the 20th century and beyond, well into this century. For example, the issue of Kurdish nationalism, the nature of nationalism itself, the question of borderlands, the territories between empires are always contested spaces, often very messy, often very violent. Another issue was the legacy of colonialism and the impact of World War I, and particularly its aftermath, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the collapse of European empires, the emergence of new nationalisms, the contested boundaries that resulted from the collapse of these empires, and then, of course, the elimination of the Tsarist Empire and the emergence of the Bolshevik state. And as Mehrdad kept working, the manuscript got longer and longer, and it became a book. And the result was the book that you showed. And it really is a significant and fascinating combination of biography of one individual, but also the history of the times in which he lived. It's obviously the work of a mature historian. It's deeply considered. It's fluidly written. And it's not only it's an important work of history, but it's a terrific read, and it has echoes that certainly resound down to today. And so what I thought we would first do is ask Mehrdad to talk a bit about Simko, who he was, what he did. Give us a bit of his story.
Mm-hmm. First of all, Ben, thank you very much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Really enjoyed our discussion last time. And thank you for inviting us. And thank you to Mike because of suggesting this discussion. But also, as Mike mentioned, and I think he's a bit too humble, he has played a amazing role, I would say, at least as far as I'm concerned, in writing this book. Without our discussions, without the issues he raised, the multiplicity of issues and discussions that can be brought into a book like this, I owe a great deal to him, and so a debt of gratitude. He's a brilliant historian, and he knows that a particular individual is not just an individual, but a collection of many different influences. And at the first glance, as Mike mentioned, here is this borderland, rebel, basically. But when you look at him and you realize, wow, there is so much more that we can bring in the context of his life and biography. So I think one of the things that fascinated me always was First World War. I think it was one of the most crucial events in history of humanity in the modern era. And why? I think because the entire geographic, political, and socio-economic picture of so many parts of the world was reshaped by it. We don't want to go into Europe right now, and we know at least in terms of degree of influence and impact. But in the case of Southwest Asia, what we call the Middle East, and especially the Turkish, Arab, Iranian, and Jewish world, it was a major event. And of course, as Mike mentioned correctly, it was a huge event in the history of Russia and later Soviet Union. What we had in 1914 when the war started was not at all what we had when it ended in 1918. I mean, in a matter of 4 to 5 years, basically by the end of Versailles, 1919, you had a different world you were living in. And I think part of it was the disintegration of the Russian Empire, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the collapse of course, Austro-Hungarian Empire, German Empire itself and its Kaiser just fell apart, but also the complete disintegration of what used to be the Persian or Iranian Empire. Though it was decaying for a long time, it just fell apart basically as a result of the First World War. And instead what you have is the emergence of numerous countries. I don't want to call it nation states because they were not really nations in the sense that we understand in the context of Europe, and the creation of the modern map of the Middle East in some ways. Nationalist, Republican, small r, Turkey, a new Iran, a nationalist Iran under a very different leadership, and then a whole series of Arab states created by the French and the British. This is all the results of the Middle East. So the map that we are dealing with today, the geopolitical situation we are dealing with, all results of the First World War in some ways. So in that context, it's very interesting. It was always very interesting that if you take the Kurds as a separate people, though they are not, and I would mention it, why not? They were the only ones in some ways who did not come out of this with a nation state of their own. Everybody gained something, at least nominally, though sometimes not what they wanted, but something, with something, with a flag, with an identity. But the Kurds did not. And in fact, what happened to them is that they were subdivided into the majority population of the Kurds in Turkey, then Iraq, northern Iraq, especially Syria and Iran, but also in the Caucasus, in the southern parts of former Russian Empire, especially in Georgia and Armenia. So that was the context, that was the sort of political and historical context. But who is Simko, as Mike mentioned? Simko would have been a very, sort of an average tribal chief. The Kurds of Iran were highly tribal. They were divided into many tribal groups. They live on the western margins of Iran. And it's very interesting, when you live in Iran, you have no idea that there are tribes in Iran. But when your mother takes you there, as I did, in that region, which is, if you want to look at the map, those of us who listen, north of Kermanshah. Kermanshah is the main city, but it's which is very close to the Iraqi border. But it has a predominantly Shia population. So it's very Persianized, though many people speak Kurdish in Kermanshah. But you feel like you are still in Iran. You know, there are ancient Persian rock reliefs, you know, going back to the times of the old Persian empires and so on and so forth. But the moment you drive north of Kermanshah, on that very narrow edge, which lies between northwestern Iran and Iraq, northwestern Iran and Turkey, you realize it has changed completely. It becomes hilly and then very mountainous. These are the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. Very beautiful, by the way. Green, lush, narrow valleys, small towns and villages. The language changes, and the population changes completely. It's predominantly Sunni Muslim, Orthodox Muslim. It's no longer Shia like Kermanshah to the south. And that goes all the way when you actually come to the border between Iran and former Soviet Union and Russia. So that very narrow corridor, that's where the majority of the Kurds live, in fact, in that narrow corridor. Today, we don't know the exact population. The Iranian government, the Islamic regime, does not release it. Anywhere between 6 to 7 million at the time. When the revolution took place, about 4.5 million. It's significant in a population of 91 million. It's a significant portion. Though in Turkey, the numbers are much larger. 25 to 30 million have been even given. I would put it at actually lower at 20 to 25 million, but it's not as large as Turkey's, but this is a population. Now, that area, because it's mountainous, it has always been very mountainous. It was the best place to breed horses. It was always a country which actually lent itself to pastoral nomadic existence. During the summers, the Kurdish tribes would take their sheep and horses and goats to the higher elevations, you know, to the mountains, because it was cooler. Pasture lands are green, very nice. And in the winter, they would come back to the valleys. It was warmer, it was much less snowy and much less humid. So that was the geographic setting that these tribal groups lived. He belonged to a tribe called Shakak. And the Shakak tribe was one of the largest Kurdish tribal groups. It had not only a population group in Iran, but it was also a large tribal group in Ottoman Empire before the First World War. What fascinated me the first time I was reading about these tribal groups, this is of course decades ago, was that they had a reputation that they were originally Christian. This was a Kurdish tribe with, you know, with churches basically. And when they converted to Islam, they adopted Sunni Islam, but Islam was never really a factor. And it's really very true about the Kurds. Religion is not really very central. It's a tribal society where you don't have any mosques, you don't have any seminaries, you don't have a clergy because they're Sunni Muslims. Women and men, you know, interact at all times on a daily basis. You don't see a single veiled woman anywhere in the Kurdish region. If you have to take care of horses, sheep and goats. You don't have time to put a veil on and go up to the mountains. And nobody cares anyway. People have to take care of their daily duties. The society itself was very much a divided society. There was an elite, the Kurdish tribal aristocracy, which lived off not only pastoral nomadism, but they were also feudal lords. They owned land in the valleys. In Kurdish, they are referred to as ashirat. Ashirat means basically the elite, aristocratic elite. They are the old warrior class. They were on their horses and, raiding and fighting each other. But then there was a peasant population, which was the subordinate class. And they had to pay taxes. They had to give a portion of the harvest to the aristocracy and so on and so forth. The peasants were much larger in terms of population. But as soon as I started looking at this social structure, I realized that the peasantry itself was very divided. There was a very large Christian Assyrian peasant population. These are the old Nestorian church of the East, which basically separated itself from the main church in Byzantium over the question of nature of Christ. They believe Christ had two natures, one human and one divine. And the Christ who was sacrificed, or who was crucified, I should say, who was sacrificed at the behest of humanity, was actually human. But the Christ who we believe to be eternal, or they believe to be eternal, then was the spiritual Christ, the divine Christ, the real Son of God. Anyway, they were Nestorians. The majority of Christians in Iran have always been either Nestorian, i.e. Assyrian, or Armenian. And here there was no exception. There was a large population of Nestorian Christian or Assyrian Christians and Armenian Christians as well. Then I also realized that all the towns and all the major urban centers of the region had a significant Jewish population, which is quite exceptional. Iran has always had a significant Jewish population, but in the large urban centers like Shiraz, like Isfahan, like Tehran and Tabriz and so on and so on, but not in rural tribal areas. But in this case, there was a significant Jewish population. And then there were other, sort of smaller sects that were there. The other thing that fascinated me about this, coming to Simko very quickly, is the missionary activities. Because there were Christian communities in northwestern Iran, starting with the various churches in Europe, various church groups. Anglicans were there, Catholics were there. Later on, Swedish and German Lutherans went there, and so on and so forth. Suddenly you have this concentration of Christian missionaries, and the largest among them were American Protestants, which is fascinating, basically. And I'm kind of situating Simko, because Simko had to deal with all these populations, Christian Assyrians, Christian Armenians, missionary groups, and so on and so forth. And I used some of their memoirs in this book because they were there and they watched how the revolt began and how it unfolded and why it was so violent at times. So you have this multiplicity of, individuals and groups. And then you have this Shakok tribe. Now, Shakoks are the largest, but they're also the most rebellious in the sense that they do not have an affiliation to a nation state or empire, as Mike mentioned. They are a borderland tribal group. So they move because of pasture lands from Iran to Ottoman Empire, from Ottoman Empire to Iran. By that very act, they are basically rejecting the idea that these frontiers and borders are legitimate For them, it's the tribal sort of land which they have the right to use, and they can go back and forth. And in the process, they might raid Assyrian community in Ottoman Empire. They might come and raid an Armenian community in Iran, whatever the case may be. And so they were considered to be troublemakers. But what the Iranians had done, they had incorporated part of that elite, the Ashirat, the aristocratic elite, into the Iranian army in order for them to become part of the military structure, and so they can benefit. If there are wars, they love to plunder, whatever. They can be used as a sort of a vanguard of Iranian forces, attacking, plundering, creating fear, and then Iranian forces or armies can go and do what they have to do. Whatever the case may be, that was in 19th century. They were settled in northwestern frontiers. And of course, the way it all started was that when Simko is a young man, he was not supposed to become the chief of his tribe because he was the second son. But he had a brother, Jafar Agha, and it all starts with his brother. And Jafar Agha is a very charismatic individual, and the Iranian government is very worried about his popularity. He's a bit of a Robin Hood character. He steals from the big landowners, even Kurdish landowners, and he distributes it among the poor. And so the Iranian government decides to, reach a compromise. And the typical thing that the Iranian state did at the time, they would give you an honorific title, they would add to your salary, they would add to the area that is under your, sort of control at the expense of other tribal chief. And so they invite his brother, Jafar Agha, to go to Tabriz, which is the capital of the northwestern Iranian province of Azerbaijan, to reach an agreement, to sign an agreement. And when he's visiting the governor, the Iranian governor writes the central government in Tehran, here is Jafar Agha. I'm suggesting that we give him a new title, we give him a new salary, we sort of appease him in the process. And of course, typical to the sometimes very narrow-minded and idiotic, policies that Tehran always adopted vis-a-vis these margins of the empire, basically. He said, nope, that's a wrong attitude. Your order is to execute him as soon as you receive this. The governor is shocked because he has given a promise in a Quran, in a holy book, that I will protect you, and now he has to kill that same man. But he cannot disobey, and of course he kills him. He kills Jafar Agha, and but the assassination is done so badly that Jafar Agha's bodyguards manage to escape, and the news goes to the Shakak tribe that the chief has been killed. And of course, because Simko is the second man in command, their father is still at the time is alive, but the boys are taking over. Simko is taken basically as the new chief of Shakak. His actual name is Ismail Agha. Ismail is like Ishmael. Simko is the short for Ismail Agha. This is kind of the endearing way. The Kurds hate these Arabic sounding names or Persian sounding names. Abdullah becomes Apo, and so on and so forth. So they shorten it, they make it softer and more attractive. So Simko begins his career as the chief of Shakak. But then it starts. It's 1905, 1906. It's the constitutional revolution in Iran. First, he flees to Ottoman Empire. The Turks realize there is an opportunity here. His brother has been killed, so there is an opportunity to recruit him. And later on, the Iranians realize what a mistake they have made. They appease him, they give him back some of the land, they bring him back to Iran. And of course, that's how it starts. All of this is in the background in the book. But the real situation starts, And during the Constitutional Revolution, he's pretty much actually against the constitutional movement, against democracy, against fundamental changes. He actually sides with the very monarchy that had killed his brother, because he sees in Iranian constitutionalists reformers who might take the land from the big landowners and distribute it among Iranian peasants. So he sides with the so-called reactionary forces. But after 1911, everything changes. Why? Russia invades Iran. He finds himself in a situation where the territory where he's operating is now occupied by the Russians. At the same time, to counter the Russians, the Ottoman Turks also occupy part of Iran. So he's sandwiched between an Iranian government, the Russians who have just invaded, the Ottomans who have also occupied part of the country. And as soon as the First World War starts, the entire situation changes. I don't want to talk about that situation is what the book deals with.
Okay.
Yeah, you referred to his career sort of in three parts, that period from 1905 up to World War One, and then there's that period of World War One, which is probably worth getting into at this point, and then also the very changed world after the end of the First World War. So it's probably worth just taking him through at least the World War One and his shifting alliances and so on during the war.
During the First World War, as I said, is a major turning point, and we have to understand, that a fundamental fact that he's still a subject of the Iranian government, meaning there's no citizenship subject in the old sense of the word, and he's living in a country which has been invaded from north by the Russians, from the west by the Ottomans, from the south by the British, though it has declared its neutrality. But nobody cares, to respect the neutrality of a country which has no muscle or no power to protect its own independence. But what happens is quite devastating. We believe now that somewhere between 25 to 30% of the Iranian population dies during First World War. These are actually underestimations. Cholera, especially dysentery, and a plague, of course, and and of course starvation, because foreign armies basically take over the harvest everywhere. I was reading as I was preparing for this that one Kurdish group, which provided the Iranian government with 2,000 horsemen, armed horsemen, cavalry basically, for protecting the border, was reduced to a group of 30 men on mules. That is, all the horses, the entire village, all their villages, and harvest was taken. And I have to tell you, the Russians were particularly brutal. In one case, I found a town where its population was attacked and partially massacred on 6 separate occasions, which tells you something about the brutality of the war.
It's worth. Your descriptions of this in the book. These are almost like biblical attacks on towns where the towns are just completely wiped out. The savagery, the level of violence and destruction is just astonishing.
We have evidence of homes actually be dismantled because wood was needed for winter. Women, of course, first targets. They were always raped and murdered, and that's why, especially in Azerbaijan, northwestern Iran, and the Kurdish one, the families would hide them in the mountains whenever foreign troops were approaching. But there was something else happening, and that was because of the supremacy of the Russians in northern Iran, northwestern Iran, and the fact that they were allies of the British, there was a great deal of hope among the Christian populations especially the Armenians and Assyrians, that with the support of European powers, in this case Russia and Great Britain, they could gain their independence or some form of autonomy. This was also the dream of the Armenians in Ottoman Empire, which partially resulted into the genocide against the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire. So when the Kurdish leaders, including Simko, realized this change in configuration of power and that the Christian communities are moving toward an alliance with the great powers like Tsarist Russia and the British Empire, they immediately, and Iran is basically as a government, is irrelevant. It has fallen apart and it cannot even defend its borders. They immediately side with the Ottoman Turks. First of all, Ottoman Turks, they're not Kurds, but they're Sunni Muslims, they're Orthodox Muslims, like the majority of the Kurds. Secondly, they're fighting the Russians and the British. They will arm us to fight the Armenian nationalists, the Assyrian nationalists, and protect our home from creation of Assyrian and Armenian enclaves. It's what I'm tracing the rise of Kurdish nationalism is not to a group of intellectuals who read books and went to universities in Europe and became convinced nationalists, but a sense of deep anxiety and insecurity about how the war was unfolding. That in the end, though we constitute the majority of the population on the ground, we will become minority communities in an Armenian-dominated Christian state or in an Assyrian Christian state where they have the Russian guns and the British technology, and we remain the peasants and the tribesmen of the mountains. So they are desperate to somehow maintain and preserve their identity and their territory. That's why it becomes even more violent. And Simko becomes a leader of these series of raids. He realizes the Ottomans share an interest with him. The Ottoman Turks are worried about the creation of an Armenian state in what is today Eastern Turkey, Eastern Anatolia, and they're worried about Armenians using Iran as a base to wage their war against the Ottoman Empire. So they're willing to give me guns, they're willing to provide me with spare parts, ammunition. So why not, find this alliance as the means through which I can get rid of the potential enemies, the Armenian Christians and the Assyrian Christians. I've found, to be very blunt, I found disturbing pictures of what Simko did. In one case, his Kurdish fighters massacred over 2,000 Assyrians. These were refugees from Ottoman Empire. They had fled into Iran. And wherever he got his hand on them, wherever he could attack and get away with it, he did. And then the Ottoman Empire collapsed. So the side that he was relying on collapsed. The Russians pushed into Iran fully, completely. They detained him as an ally of the Turks. They sent him to what is today Georgia, Republic of Georgia. He probably convinced himself he might be executed by the Russians. But he was a shrewd politician. He was a shrewd tactician. He switched and he became a sort of ally of the Russians. And then, of course, what happened in the process also was that the Russian Empire collapsed. So it made it a bit easier for him. And he realized to the West, though the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, there was a nationalist movement under what became the Republican Turkey, under Ataturk, who was fighting from across the border from Iran. And for that reason, he could rely on them. So he switched back to the Turks again, receiving arms. That's what the borderland politics is. It has no ally. It just changes constantly, basically.
But also, it's interesting, as you point out in the book, that what you just described is, as the war contributed to emerging nationalism in so many groups, it did among the Kurds, but the Kurdish nationalism was defined in opposition
Yes.
to the Assyrians,
Yes.
and the
Armenians,
Armenians, the Christian groups. And that helped define Kurdish nationalism, particularly to the extent that he adopted it, Simko's as well.
Yeah, and completely correct. And the final chapter in all this, in terms of just in the context of the First World War, is that the Russian army has basically disintegrated into a band of marauders and raiders because there is no authority within the ranks of the Russian armed forces. And they become even more dangerous, undisciplined, disorganized band of armed men who basically raid villages and towns inside Iran as they're going back to Russia. But he finds it as a golden opportunity to buy as much arm as possible from the fleeing Russian troops. He actually buys machine guns and he buys cannons, from the Russians as they're fleeing. That's one thing. The other thing is that now the British are left all alone in Iran. He realizes the configuration of power is in favor of the British. And these are the last months of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the Ottomans are still kicking a little bit. And so the British thinking of themselves as being so smart and so much in control of events, they decide, well, I think it's the time to bring the Kurds under Simko, to bring the Armenian Christians, and to bring the Assyrian Christians, and form an alliance under the protection of the British. Negotiations can do wonders. So they go to Simko and they offer him a kind of united front. We will pay you, we will protect you, we will provide you with whatever you need. Just put your historical animosities, insecurities, and anxieties aside and work with us. And we want you to come around and negotiate with the principal leader here, whose name comes up in the book several times, of course. His name is Mar Shimon. Mar Shimon is the leader of the Assyrian Christian community, but the Armenians also pay a great deal of respect to him. Mar Shimon has created an army. The Assyrians view him both as their political and religious leader, and he's willing to form an alliance with the Kurds and Armenians to bring the war to an end in northwestern Iran. And of course, Simko, it's so brutal at the same time, so incredibly intriguing, that this illiterate Kurdish chief reads the situation much better than the British and promises the British that he will do anything they want him to do, including an alliance with his old enemies, the Assyrian and Armenian Christians. And they set up a meeting between him, Simko, the Kurdish leader, and Mar Shimon, the leader of the Christian Assyrians. They meet for tea. They have a long meeting. After they come out of the building, Simko kisses the hands of Mar Shimon, and he says, this brotherhood will last for a long time. And Mar Shimon turns to go into his carriage, and Simko shoots him in the back. And that starts another set of massacre. In fact, what he is now trying to do is cleanse the entire region from any Christian community, Assyrian or Armenian. With that massacre, which starts with assassination of Mar Shimon, he emerges as the most powerful man in northwestern Iran. And since the Iranian government has disappeared, the Russian government has disappeared in terms of Tsarist government. The Ottoman Empire has collapsed. and the British are just a temporary occupying force, he declares more or less an autonomous or independent sort of enclave in northwestern Iran. And for the first time, you have a Kurdish leader who actually wants to create a state of his own. So it comes out of these anxieties, insecurities, rivalries, but also a very shrewd and ambitious man who wants to use this opportunity to create his own country.
Yeah, and I think that, again, the opportunity for this obviously emerged from the chaos created by the First World War, and that really takes us up to what you describe as the third major portion of his career, which is that post-World War I period when various nationalities in Eastern Europe and elsewhere are jockeying for homelands. There are various people in the Middle East jockeying for homelands and so on. And the Kurds are part of that. And it seems that for Simko, it's almost a matter of convenience at times rather than as a question of principle, and always in opposition. But this period about after the war, where he makes some sort of attempt to create an independent Kurdish state is also worth, I think, going before we start talking about some of the themes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's actually the most critical period, because from 1918 to 1921, there is no force really to stop him. And because in Turkey you have a nationalist movement under future Ataturk, which will create the modern Republic of Turkey, he has actually a permanent supplier of guns, arms, and in fact Turkish officers who served with him with their own flag. There is a Turkish flag that they carry whenever they attack somewhere together with Simko. The Iranian government has no muscle, has no ability to stop him. And he grows in terms of his power. He expands his power. But you're completely right, Mike, because this is why in the title I use proto-nationalism. That is, nationalism is usually identified as the ideology of an urban-based intelligentsia, right? These are teachers, university professors, ideologues, government officials, people in the middle or lower middle classes who have a tendency to educate themselves, but also use that education to demonstrate their superiority mentally, intellectually, politically. In the Kurdish society in northwestern Iran, where Simko is operating, such a thing does not exist. The majority of people are either peasants, again, or members of a tribe. So there is no big city, there is no educated Kurdish elite, but there are tribal chiefs who are worried about their future and worried about an Armenian state or Assyrian state to be created, or worse even for them, an Iranian state, basically getting its mess together and creating a central government, so they have to prevent that as well. So for 3 years, from 1918 to 1921, he basically runs the show in northwestern Iran, and he becomes more nationalistic, believing in the fact that he can start the process of laying the foundation. For example, as he moves more to the south, he takes over this major Kurdish town, and the first thing he does, he actually opens a newspaper. That's a sign that he understands that in order to establish your popularity or your legitimacy, you need to also bring the educated population, though very small, behind himself.
I think it's also it's interesting. A point that you make is that not only did they lack that urban intellectual base to provide the ideology for nationalism, but they never had the institutional structures either.
Yeah.
I mean, his armies were not funded by a systematic tax base or something by a central government. They're funded by plunder.
Yes.
And in that sense, he's more like a medieval warlord than a modern nationalist leader.
Yeah.
They didn't have the kind of basis for nationalism based in land, ethnicity, religion, that drove other nationalist movements. And so it's missing kind of all the elements, and yet it's moving in that direction, which is why I think your idea of proto-nationalism is a really good one.
I think the biggest issue that I had with this book is to answer this question: can tribalism produce nationalism? I mean, or does nationalism require a middle-class, urban-based intellectual class to basically promote certain ideas? And that's why I'm not comfortable with either saying yes or no. I think nationalism served him to a degree, but it was a very crude form of ideological orientation without not much articulation. And he used it conveniently because, as you mentioned correctly, there is no religious legitimacy to Simko. Politically, he's relying on a tribal army. Tribes usually are loyal to their own chiefs. He couldn't tell other chiefs to just follow him. So the thing he could approach was, what unites us is that we are all Kurds, we speak similar languages or dialects, and we can unify under this idea of Kurdishness, for lack of a better word, to establish ourselves against the Turks, against the Persians, against the Russians, against others.
Yeah, and particularly against the Assyrians and Armenians.
And Assyrians and Armenians, yeah. So he continued to be very anti-Assyrian, anti-Armenian. I have to say this now in this context. I was shocked when I began to work on this. I've been reading about this, though it's, it was published in 2023 after about a year or two of really thinking about it as an article. But I've been thinking about it, reading more since 2019. I was collecting material and so on. And I have to tell you, the amazing absence of any discussion about what happened in the First World War in any in-depth fashion, other than just the repeating of, there were 3 agreements between the French and the British, Sykes-Picot and Hussein Macmillan and the Balfour Declaration and so on and so forth, not only between the British and the French, but also between the British and the Arab leadership, between the British and the Jewish Zionist leadership. These are just, every time you repeat this. But when it came to the Kurds, it was very interesting. Nothing, to the point that I'm reading one of the first articles I read. It says, well, of course, Simko was a nationalist, and his nationalism was a response to the policies of the Iran central government under Reza Shah, who was the father of the last Shah of Iran. And because he was a Persian nationalist, Simko was responding to it. And just a month or two into reading this material, I realized this could not even be true. Reza Shah, the founder of modern Iran, did not come to power until 1921. Simko was there for years before that. It couldn't be a response to any policies. And then, even when he came to power, the Iranian central government had no muscle to tell Simko to do anything, let alone Persianize the Kurdish region. See, when somebody sitting in London is writing or is talking, it's kind of self-projection. Why am I a Kurdish nationalist? Is because I hate the Persianist policies of the pro-Persianist policies of the Iranian government. So Simko must have felt the same. Simko could not read, could not write, had no idea what Persianist policies was. He wanted to maintain the tribal order, the traditional order. He wanted to maintain his power. And he was worried about those forces which threatened it, the Armenians, the Assyrians, to some degree the Russians and the British.
And you point out what kind of a curious nationalist makes alliances with imperial powers who are coming in to dominate his people. And you think about it, at various times, the Russians, the Turks, the Iranians, the British, none of whom had any interest in Kurdish nationalism except maybe to crush it. And I mean that's a curious career path for what we often think of as a nationalist leader.
Completely the reverse, in fact, of a nationalist leader. And it's very interesting. We have to understand the patron-client relationship that he always found himself. For a borderland sort of tribal chief, you always had to have a patron to support you, protect you against the other borderland powers. So you needed the Russians to protect you against the Iranians. You needed the Iranians to protect you against the Ottoman Turks. You needed the Ottoman Turks to protect you against the Iranians. So that's why he was constantly sort of rotating, basically. And he was right where these imperial powers did not exercise highly centralized authority. They're on the border. So that's exactly mountainous, wild, as far as they're concerned. So let these, tribes roam around, basically. And he used that in order to survive. But it was always a patron for him, and he was the client. Only from 1918 to 1921, there was no patron, at least not as much as before, though the Turks were helping him. And he managed to become the patron himself.
Yeah, and even with that, it's fascinating what medieval historians call sub-infeudation, which is that the lord, the king, has vassals, but they have vassals under them, and it's really, I guess we're not supposed to say pre-modern anymore, but it is a pre-modern arrangement, and it's one that didn't necessarily lend itself either to what we today readily identify as a nationalist movement, or to even necessarily to success in that particular environment, but it's hard to see what other options there are too.
And I realized very quickly, not jumping to our present time, for example, Simko is a big-time Kurdish national hero in the autonomous region of northern Iraq today, among the Kurds, because they have an autonomous region. His portraits are there. There are streets named after him. There are TV shows praising him. But you know that such approach feels itself embarrassed by admitting that this guy was constantly changing sides and becoming himself the client of an imperial patron. What kind of nationalist are you that you're getting paid by the Russians? What kind of nationalist are you that you're receiving land and favors from a highly brutal and reactionary regime in Iran? Or what kind of nationalist leader are you that you go and get arms from a nationalist leader named Atatürk, who massacred the Kurds later on? Do you see? So this kind of being divided, how to portray him. If you want to portray him as a nationalist leader, you have to deny part of his history and biography. And it's quite interesting, because the Kurds are now emerging as a future nation state, probably at one point, or at least by separate identity of their own. And it's an effort to find heroes in this history. And you cannot just stay with Saladin and the Crusades. You have to come to more modern times. And Simko is the First World War kind of hero. But when you look at it, he's anything but.
Yeah, he functions very much as a tribal leader, as kind of a borderland brigand who makes a deal with whatever devil is convenient at the moment.
Yeah. And, just my last sentence on that is, when I use the missionaries, basically, the Protestant and Catholic especially, they are in this town, which is now called Mahabad, And they have left their memoirs when Simko entered the city. And it's amazing because the town had a Kurdish majority, very large Kurdish majority. It's in Iran, it's in Western Iran. It had a Persian minority. It also had Jewish, Assyrian, Armenians. The Jews, Armenians, and Assyrians fled the city before even he comes. He arrives. He comes, and the first thing he does, there is an Iranian garrison. He executes all of them. They are basically stripped naked, and they are all machine gunned. And then you think, well, he wants to destroy any semblance of Iranian army there. Then he goes after prominent Kurdish leaders. He raids their homes. He basically takes them. And when some of them argue with him and disagree, he kills all of them as well. Then they get into raping some members of the Christian missionaries. See, when you look at it, you see this hostility across the border, and you see this very crude and violent form of tribal raids and plundering that has no limit and no ideology. It's all about whatever I can get right now.
It's also the only way to fund an army.
Yeah, exactly. It's find a part of funding his operations. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that ties into this story, of course, is the Russian Revolution.
Yes.
And the emergence of a Bolshevik state that also engaged in some raiding and so on their own. I mean, you look at Red Brigades and so on. And I think that is also, it's a fascinating element of the story, because when the Bolsheviks play into this thing, it's in one case a situation where the more things change, the more they stay the same, and yet things do change.
Yeah, there was a 1907. Those who might listen to this program, they might want to look at it. The 1907 St. Petersburg Convention. In that document, which is a very important document, I realized when I read it very carefully. I knew about it, I knew what it had done, but I hadn't read it as carefully as I should. Something big is happening. That is, the British and the Russians had always looked at Iran and Afghanistan, and even to some degree Tibet, Western China, as the buffer between the British in India and the Russians in Central Asia. But of course, they hadn't predicted the rise of a new European power, namely Germany. So by 1907, they were both threatened by the rise of this very strong, formerly Prussia, but now German state. And they're realizing it's militarizing itself. It is gaining more momentum in its alliance with Ottoman Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they have to, that is the British and the Russians, have to set aside their differences and reach a compromise on Middle East and Central Asia. So the 1907 convention is basically an attempt to end the British-Russian rivalry over Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. So what happens is Afghanistan is declared as a protectorate under the British. Northern Iran is given to the Russian. Southern Iran, at least a large segment of it, to the British, who had also discovered oil, and they wanted to protect their emerging oil empire and the oil refinery they were going to build. And then in the middle, between northern Iran and southern Iran, they created a neutral zone. And that neutral zone belonged to the Iranians, which is fascinating how generous. They partition a country and they leave a neutral zone for the natives. Anyway, but given that, it shows that after 1907, the Russians were actually trying to separate northern Iran from the Iranian state and make it part of Russia, like a republic, like Azerbaijan, like Tajikistan, like Uzbekistan. It would become Iranistan. I don't know what the name would be. But that was the plan. And Simko was part of this plan. That is, when it came to the Kurds, They needed pro-Russian Kurdish leaders who had received money and guns, and they would be the governors of a province called Kurdistan or whatever, under Russian tutelage or Russian protection. That was the plan for Simko originally. But when the Russian Empire collapsed, the Bolsheviks came, they realized there was another interest in having Simko. That interest was, of course, to have an ally inside Iran to foment maybe socialist revolution, because Simko had written to the Bolsheviks and said, I'm willing to move towards socialism. I mean, this guy can be anything. So the Soviets were also in contact with him. We believe that he received some money and arms from the Bolsheviks also. He's a man of all hours, basically, completely in some ways non-ideological, but very pragmatic. And when the British found out that he was actually in touch with the Bolsheviks, they panicked. They were considering him for a while, and they thought, no, he's a full-time opportunist, and we cannot trust him.
Yeah, and that actually is probably worth taking him to the end of his life, that segment after his peak period of power and influence, and then sort of a decline in the later years.
So in 1921, Iran goes through a military coup. The father of the last Shah establishes himself first as a military dictator, and then as the Shah of Iran in 1925-26. And the declaration is made in 25. The actual ceremony is 1926. And of course, the situation is such that with the emergence of a new kind of more modern state, the Iranians began to centralize all power in the hands of their government, in the hands of the central government. And one of the prerequisites of creating a nation state is to destroy all alternative power structures, especially in the margins of the state, especially in provinces, especially among tribal groups. So they issue a decree disarming all the feudal lords, disarming all the tribal chiefs. Simko does not obey, of course. And so the Iranian army manages to muster sufficient amount of power. By then, from a force of, can you imagine the entire country during the First World War, Iran, a large country, size of Western Europe, basically, the entire Western Europe, had an army of 12,000, which means it's meaningless. They couldn't even protect their capital. By 1921, 22, they are approaching about 45,000, 50,000. They have bought planes from France. They have bought modern armored division cars and so on and so forth. And they unleashed this against Simko. And Simko is wiped out. His army is basically destroyed. And they push him into Turkey first. And then from Turkey, he flees to Iraq. And he goes back and forth between Iraq and Turkey. They finally, when he realizes what the new nationalist government in Turkey is doing under Ataturk, which is basically massacring the Kurds, he pleads with Iran to take him back. And it's very interesting. At that point, you realize this national identity is also very fluid. He says, as you know, and he's right, the Kurds are an Iranian people. I am an Iranian subject. I'm an Iranian myself. This nonsense about us being different and so on. So he becomes a total, sort of faithful subject of the Shah, of the new Shah, of course. Please accept me, and so on and so on. And the new Shah actually said, okay, let's bring him. Nothing wrong. The guy wants, So he goes, and this is, of course, right before Reza Shah becomes the official Shah of Iran. And he's so curious that he goes to northwestern Iran and he's visiting several cities, towns, urban centers. But he goes to the tribal area, and he asks to see Simko. And in a very interesting moment in the book, Reza Shah, the founder of the last dynasty of Iran, the Pahlavi dynasty, visits or meets with the most famous Kurdish tribal chief and a rebel of all kinds. Simko goes into the back of the car, and Reza Shah basically tells him, "Oh, you look so young," and so on and so forth. And do you know how to write or read? And he says, "No, I'm illiterate." He said, "But you speak perfect Persian better than I do." And so they start talking basically, and the result is Reza Shah is reassured that he is loyal. But of course, lo and behold, as soon as he returns, Simko raises the flag of rebellion again, and this time they really chase him out, and he goes into Iraq. He's there until 1930, 1929-30. And then the Iranian government realizes as long as this guy lives, we will have problems. So they resort to a trick, which Simko had always tricked out other people, by kissing the leader of the Assyrian movement in 1918 and then assassinating him. So now it's their turn. They give him a position. They give him a governorship in Western Iran. They invite him back with promises of good treatment. And Simko returns with his men. He goes into the town where he's assigned to be the governor, Ushnu or Ushnaviye, which is very close to the border with Iraq. And they tell him, yeah, there will be an Iranian army officer. And the Kurds have this tradition, Iranians also in general. When somebody of some prominence comes to your town, you go out of town in order to welcome him on the road to the town. And Simko waits and waits with all his bodyguards and so on and so forth. And of course, nobody shows up. And somebody shows up, and finally, toward the evening, and he says, there was a car problem. So why don't you go back to the town, and he will arrive here tomorrow and you can visit him. So they all go back. And of course, in his absence from the town, the Iranian army has covered all the bases, all the roofs and all the houses around Simko's home. And as he approaches his home, they shoot him. And that's the end of it. But of course, just because of that, which I think was, despite all his brutality, was very stupid, because he becomes a martyr.
Right.
And they turned him into a national hero of some sort. If they had just dealt with him as, troublemaker, you don't have to be so dramatic as to kill the man. But of course, I'm sitting here from a distance and judging. But they judged him as a security threat, and they got rid of him. And of course, that's the end of it. But of course, as soon as this happens, his name goes to the top of the list as a national hero, as a martyr. It's fascinating. And this is my last sentence on this, is that the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, KDPI, which is the main opposition, which was the main opposition to the Shah and today the main opposition to the Islamic regime. Qasemlu, who was the Secretary General of Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, was proud to say, on the year Simko was assassinated, I was born. So, see, that tells you that a new generation of more left-leaning Kurdish intellectuals now emerge, and they're looking for heroes. And in Simko, they find one.
Yeah. Or created one.
Yeah. So that's basically the essence of the book. Through Simko, I've tried to sort of analyze the impact of the First World War on the Middle East, on Iran, on Ottoman Empire, on the Caucasus, southern Russia, and on the Kurds, and to understand why you have the beginning of the first Kurdish nationalist movement. And instead of just overgeneralized abstractions, so, oh, it was a response to this, this one-liner kind of thing, I've tried to sort of understand. And I have to say, as my last sentence, that I was very surprised by my own findings, that in fact he was far more complicated, he was much more complex, multifaceted. And I also found something about nationalism, that nationalism does not necessarily come from reading books or going to universities or being impacted by some European philosopher. It actually can come from your very existential and regional geographic sort of location. And the fact that you are absolutely worried about your own survival, and you have a sense of inferiority complex, that the Assyrian Christians are much more educated, the Armenian Christians are much more prosperous and educated, and your people are behind, you have remained uneducated, you better do something before it's too late. And that's what nationalism is all about. It's a response to other people's national identity. You copy them, basically. I don't want to finish this, it's just an afterthought. When I was studying the Middle East, I saw the same thing among the Palestinians. Palestinian nationalism is the exact response to the Zionist movement. How the Jewish population, how educated it was, how advanced it was, and that we will never get anywhere unless we copy the Jewish society. So in some ways, the Palestinian movement, at least in the beginning, not now under Hamas, but in the beginning, it was a catch-up kind of movement. Let's catch up with such an advanced society and at least mimic them in terms of education, in terms of understanding, and in terms of national consciousness.
It's also funny that, of course, Arafat wound up more than flirting with the Soviet Union. Yeah. And if you think about this story, with a couple of different twists and turns, he could have been the commissar for whatever, and Kurdistan or whatever it was, for the Soviets. And again, remember who the commissar for nationalities was? This time it was Stalin. Yeah. So I mean, it's fascinating to see how that could shift. But I think that's one of the great insights is the ways in which nationalism forms in opposition to other nationalism, either defensively or perhaps aggressively. And I think it's a more, in many ways, a more interesting and realistic analysis of nationalism than, say, the one in Yoram Hazony's book, which we did on the radio show, but where he has this wonderful theoretical structure, sort of empires versus nationalism and so on. But the way you've laid it out with, again, the particularity of the case on the ground is it looks very different. It's not as clean. It's not as simple. And I guess with that, we've probably run over the time that you allocated to us anyway. But no. That's why they have editing.
Yeah, that's right.
And just my lesson is in response to you, and in such a contrast to, and he's an Iranian subject, but in such a contrast to Persian nationalism itself. Persian nationalism was very anti-Russian, anti-British because of the colonial presence. And he, in northwestern Iran, to gain its independence, he needed to work with the Russians, he needed to work with the British, he needed to work with the Turks. So in sharp contrast to Persian nationalism, Kurdish nationalism has no bias against the Russians. Right. Whoever can help us, whoever can arm me and finance me, I will go with that. Yeah, so and there is this pragmatic nationalism that Simko displays.
And it's very different from the forms of nationalism of the Persian intellectuals you wrote about in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah, they are city intellectuals, and much of their nationalism is a result of reading, educating themselves, whereas Simko, such a phenomenon is completely absent.
Yeah. I was able to access the outline of your book online, and I noticed that you mentioned the Darcy concession in 1901 and some of the actions taken by British oil interests in the region. And I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate upon the history of the Darcy
concession,
negotiation, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that emerged after that, which later became the British Petroleum Company, correct? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, was the holder of the largest refinery in the world
in Abadan.
Okay, and I was just wondering how that impacted Kurdish nationalism and the geopolitics in the region.
That's an excellent question, and thank you for raising it. Darcy was an Australian originally, and of course a British subject, traveled extensively, ended up in Iran and visiting the country, fascinated by its history, ancient as it is, and was in southwestern Iran, which is one of the centers of the ancient Persian civilization. Cities like Susa, Shush today. There is the tomb of Daniel. It's a beautiful tomb. Jewish pilgrims come there. Susa is also the ancient capital of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. The remnants of palaces and so on and so forth. So he goes to see these monuments and ruins, and he realizes children are playing, and they are throwing things on the ground. Something is running, throwing things on the ground, and it ignites with fire. And he realizes instead of water, it's oil running on the surface. And of course, you can realize that a business-minded person is. Can you imagine how much oil there is? That there's oil on the surface rather than geologically exploring it. So he brings people, and he realizes, wow, this is a gold mine of petroleum. And of course, it starts from north, because geologically, if you look at it, it actually starts on the southern regions of the Kurdish populated regions, and then it comes south all the way to the mouth of the Persian Gulf. And so he wants a concession. And this is, of course, early 20th century. The Iranian government is bankrupt, run by the most incompetent, the most managerially embarrassing sort of government Iran has ever had. And so he provides what it can only be called a bribe to the Shah at the time, that he will give him an annual income. And of course, the Shah loves it, because a check in sterling pound, British sterling pound is going to be nice. He gives a check to the prime minister, and he gives a check to the so-called minister of engineering and development, which is basically the equivalent of secretary for interior, And so he gets a concession. That concession, believe it or not, was for 60 years, 60. That is in return for 3 bribes. Can you imagine?
It's a real good deal.
Billions of dollars worth of oil, and this shows where the Middle East is at the time, and how behind and how uninformed the ruling elite is. At any rate, Darcy buys this, and of course the British realize, this is a gold mine. And starting in 1907, 1908, after the St. Petersburg Convention, the British, looking at the Germans, are realizing there has to be some real changes in their military technology. And one of them, as far as the British Navy is concerned, is to convert from coal to oil. This is a big, big decision on the part of the British. And they're looking, therefore, for possibilities of sources for petroleum. And of course, they realize Darcy, and here it is. he is telling them there is oil running underground and so on and so forth. So what they do in 1909 is they buy 51% of the shares, and they create what came to be known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later renamed Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later renamed BP, British Petroleum. So they buy the lion's share, and it became right away it became the most profitable economic venture in the entire British economy. Wow. It was millions of dollars, but because they had this 60-year contract, basically concession, they didn't feel they needed to give any money to the Iranian government, and it became the source of a great deal of anger and dissatisfaction. And of course, from that money, they could run the entire Iranian government, because they could buy the favors of chiefs, Kurdish chiefs, southwestern Iran, Bakhtiyari chiefs, landlords, and maintain a navy. And of course, by 1912, they built what you correctly said, the largest oil refinery in the world. And that's at Abadan. And it stayed until 1980, when Saddam Hussein destroyed it. It has been rebuilt to a large degree, but I have visited Abadan several times. The British staff who ran the oil refinery built one of the most modern cities in Iran. Abadan was built on the basis of a British urban plan. The first time I went there, I was a very young guy. I was in elementary school, in fact, when I went to Abadan. And to tell you a distance, it takes 2 years by 2 days by train to get there, a day and a half at least. And by the time you get to Abadan, it's at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, much warmer than Tehran. Tehran mountain is cold. And there you have palm trees. It's like Florida almost. And beautiful city. They had a very colonial when you go there, you have polo fields, you have swimming pools, you have tennis courts, all sorts of things. And all the houses, instead of the ancient Persian architecture of alleys and, narrow streets, all the houses are numbered and so on and so forth. Very nicely built, actually. Abadan is, I don't know what happened to it after the war. It was probably devastated by the Iraqis, but the city was just beautiful. Shopping centers, a Jewish population, a Christian population, majority Persian-speaking Iranian population. But that was the oil refinery, and a lot of Iranians worked there. In 1951, under a nationalist government by Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran tried to take over the refinery. They did. They actually expelled the British from Abadan. But then after 1953, when Mossadegh was overthrown, the oil refinery was reorganized, this time under Iranians, with a lot of help from the Eisenhower administration. And Iran signed a new oil agreement with a consortium. So 40% of the oil was sold to U.S. oil companies, Mobil, Texaco, and so on and so forth. Another 40% to British Petroleum. The remaining 20%, because of antitrust laws in this country, was divided. Dutch Shell, French oil companies, and so on. To contextualize, the British were not willing to help Simko in any realistic fashion. Why? Because they wanted to keep Iran as a unified nation. The territorial integrity of Iran was very important because of their oil interest. And Simko undermining that, and also negotiating in the back with Ataturk in Turkey and the Bolsheviks. Remember, we were not a friend of Turkey for a long time because Ataturk himself was receiving arms from the Soviets and being in touch with the Bolsheviks. Can you imagine northwestern Iran going in such close proximity to the British in southwestern Iran and the oil fields, they could not afford allowing a Kurdish nationalist creating a Kurdish state within Iran and threatening their economic interests. Remember also, please, that India did not gain its independence until August of 1947. Any foothold on that Persian Gulf would have meant threatening British interest in India.
Right.
And for them, Abadan, the oil fields, and India were hand in hand in terms of the British interest in the region.
Yeah, I mean, that's the great game, you know,
exactly.
the British and the access to India it was so central. But I was going to let the book have the final word. Simko was fighting to preserve a privileged way of life that was disappearing as fast as tribes and tribal chiefs came under attack by the newly emerging nation states of the region. Their Kurdish chief was born and raised when multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, and multi-religious empires reigned supreme. He developed his political skills in the borderlands of such empires, which had been born of war with their frontiers fashioned by centuries of conquest and conflict. Moreover, these borderlands contained vast contested territories claimed by imperial bureaucracies that did not, in fact, control them. The contested territories lying between the rapidly declining empires allowed tribal chiefs to carve out autonomous political entities where they survived by playing one imperialist power against another. And that's the story we've been talking about.
Yeah, exactly. You had another question, don't...
Oh,
don't
yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I was reading the Grand Chessboard by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Yeah, to try to prepare myself for this discussion. I mean, he's kind of a dubious figure, but
no, it's fascinating.
But yeah, he's
a very bright guy.
Yeah, he's very smart, and he put forward an interesting argument that Azerbaijan and the neighboring regions were sort of a cork, as he called it, on the bottle of the Central Asia, sort of preventing Russia from accessing Central Asia.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting in light of the recent treaty between Azerbaijan and Armenia to allow for the passage of an oil pipeline in the Zangezur corridor. And so I was just wondering if you'd like to elaborate on those issues.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, I didn't like a lot of his policies, but I respect him because he was one of the last officials in the White House to read. At least he studied, and he had his own, of course, conclusions that we may agree or disagree with, and he was a Cold War warrior in some ways, and being Polish originally added to his intense anxiety about Soviet Union and Russia itself, which I share with him, by the way. But he understood something fundamentally, that Russia was way out of its own national boundaries, where the Russians lived, for a reason, because its political culture was always imperial. That is, one of the reasons for the collapse of Soviet Union and the emergence of a nationalist like Putin is because that dream was shattered with the collapse of Soviet Union. And Putin has promised to rebuild it, though he has fundamental problems, as you see in Ukraine, because that old imperial regime cannot reproduce itself in a world where computers and social media and a very different generation lives. Neither Ukrainians nor anybody else will take the Russian armies and obey. They will fight back, as you have seen their heroic fight. But I think Brzezinski understands that the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the countries of Southern Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and the 5 republics of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. These are all beyond Russia's border, but they are viewed by the Russians as buffer between themselves and China. buffer between themselves and the British in India, originally at least, buffer between them and the Muslim Middle East, whether it's Iran or Turkey or the Arab Middle East. That is, it kind of creates a belt. And of course, the Baltic states protects it from Europe and a possible invasion again. Germany, NATO today, and so on and so forth. But this is the mentality. It's imperial, but it's incredibly insecure and anxious because it has been invaded by Napoleon, by Hitler, and so on and so forth. Russians, as Putin gave a lecture to President Obama, live in this permanent sense of insecurity about their future. And I think part of the reason we have such a hard time finding peace about Ukraine is that they see Ukraine as NATO moving into their border, European Union moving into their border, therefore they should be stopped.
Yeah, and that desire for borders is related to economics. I mean, you saw that at the end of World War II when Stalin wanted these buffer states in Eastern Europe. So not only so they couldn't be invaded again, well, why not have democratic countries? They can be buffers. Stalin's view was that the United States was so economically powerful that it would trade with them and therefore exert influence, and therefore they would not be dependable allies or buffers. So he left the Red Army in there to make sure they would be. And I think that Putin has some of that same attitude or belief. And again, the going back to Mehrdad's use of the term imperial, because I think it's very important. This was not like the Baltic states, which was taken by the Soviet Union. The Tsar took this. This was part of Imperial Russia.
Yeah. And I think so I have a very different view of like Bolshevik revolution. People are socialist revolution for justice. I think it was actually an attempt to save the Russian Empire under a new ideology. I think Lenin was as much of an imperialist as Stalin was, as the Tsars. But they saw that the internal conflicts, economic degradation, and so on and so forth, was such that this empire needed a new ideology as the glue, as a cement to keep it together. In fact, what really is interesting is what happened to the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany after the First World War should have happened to Russia at that time. And it did happen partially, but the Bolshevik Revolution re-linked it together. And it then happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union disintegrated. The Soviet Union's disintegration is actually what should have happened in 1917. But the communists, under the slogan, Proletariat of the World Unite, basically kept all these non-Russian entities, governments, or countries actually, under Russian domination. But I have to come to this, what you mentioned, very important, this Zangzur area. I think it was a brilliant move, to be very blunt with you. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. You find Russia in a very weak position. Busy in Ukraine, overwhelmed in Ukraine, bleeding in Ukraine, embarrassed in Ukraine, however, really under pressure from United States and European allies, in the arms of China to somehow survive economically, selling its petroleum and gas to the Chinese. That's very embarrassing for a proud Russian imperial regime like Putin's. But the Caucasus was the backyard of Russia. At any point they wanted, they would send, look what they did to Georgia. President Saakashvili of Georgia, whom I have met, he tried to create an independent Georgian state, and what did they do? They just went and invaded it. And they almost partitioned Georgia by force. That's when Putin was not busy in Ukraine. Once he got busy in Ukraine, Azerbaijanis could breathe. They signed a new oil agreement with various oil companies, British Petroleum, US oil companies, and Armenians also began to sort of flex their muscles. But this historical animosity between the two, Armenia and Azerbaijan, had also given an excuse for Turkey to become involved. And Turkey was arming and financing President Aliyev in Azerbaijan because Armenia is the old enemy of Turkey, and they wanted to somehow sandwich, basically ham sandwiched, as they call it, Armenia between Azerbaijan to the east and Turkey to the west. The only country which was, to some degree supporting Armenia, aside from Russia, was Iran, to the shock and surprise of everyone. But given Iran's problems itself, Armenia could not rely on it. So the essence of that problem was, as Stalin had always manufactured artificial problems, was that there is Armenia, there is Azerbaijan, two republics, former Soviet Union. There was an enclave, which was called Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno in Russian means mountainous Karabakh. 90-some% Armenian population. He carved this Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenian enclave, and gave it to Azerbaijan. Why would you do that? A psychiatrist would tell you that he was a Georgian, and because of that he hated Armenians, which the Georgians do. But aside from that, why was he doing? To create conflict between two neighboring states, so Russia can always send the Red Army, say, oh, we will bring peace, you cannot fight over this. He created an artificial. So Soviet Union collapses. What does Armenia do? The first thing they do, they send their armies, they take over Nagorno-Karabakh. When Azerbaijan sent its army, it was defeated by the Armenians. So 14% of Azerbaijan was taken over by Armenia. That was an Armenian enclave. They claimed it, they took it, they seized it. Russia supported it at the time, free of any conflict. Iran also cheered a little bit. Azerbaijan was humiliated. Azerbaijan went into the arms of Turkey to rearm itself. And recently, they used Turkish arms and money to take away not all of the Nagorno-Karabakh, but a good part of it back. So this conflict is just going on completely over how Soviet Union basically created it back in times of Stalin. But meanwhile, something much more important, Azerbaijan is sitting on an ocean of oil, and it doesn't have common borders with Europe, but it wants to ship its oil from the region, from the Caucasus. So it builds a pipeline. The pipeline should go through Turkey to a port into European markets. So who will guarantee this, though? And how would Azerbaijan link it up? Now, I know we are confusing people unless they look at the map. Azerbaijan actually is two Azerbaijans. Mm-hmm. Azerbaijan to the east, and then Armenia cuts it through. Look what's Stalin did. And then there is this autonomous region called Nakhchivan, or Nakhichvan, as the Armenians call it, Nakhchivan. Nakhchivan is part of Azerbaijan, but did not have common border with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan wanted to connect itself to Nakhchivan and via Nakhchivan to Turkey, so this pipeline can go through, basically. But Armenia blocked it. So there is that line Zangzur, right, which is right north of the border with Iran and Armenia, right? So President Trump comes in, looks at this situation. You want to get rid of the Russians permanently. You want to also bring down Turkey's influence as much as you can, because Erdogan is such a megalomaniac. You also want to make sure that Azerbaijani oil reaches Western markets, and you want to make United States a major player. What do? You go to the two sides and say, I'm going to guarantee peace between your two governments. At the same time, I'm going to provide security to the Zangzur area, and we're going to be there for 99 years or 100 years, and U.S. oil companies would help. Armenia is secure. Azerbaijan, you guarantee the territorial integrity of Armenia. Armenia, you guarantee that you will not go and seize more territory in that Nagorno-Karabakh enclave, and you will both benefit from shipment of oil. And of course, a little bit of money help to Armenia, which is struggling, is always helpful. You got a deal. And suddenly, United States is sitting, just imagine this, 4 kilometers from the Iranian border. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
On the most strategic area, which is Azerbaijan of Iran, because Iran also has an Azerbaijan. And Iran is now looking to the north. There's United States right on top of it, staring at it. And the two countries that used to be so close, Azerbaijan and Armenia, are now friends of the White House. And Iranians are panicking. The Iranian regime is panicking. Putin is furious. Erdogan, a bit happy, but not that happy. Because as long as United States was not there, he was the kingmaker. And now he isn't. And he cannot foment conflict against Armenia. So in some ways, in one shot, we neutralized Russia, Iran, and to some degree Turkey. Wow. That was brilliant. And it's just amazed that this is not analyzed as we have discussed it here.
Oh. Well, great. I'm glad we could educate the world on the momentous occasion. I guess sort of in closing, how do you hope your book will help inform American foreign policy in the region, and what do you think is the most enduring lesson to be learned from Simco's history?
I think that question needs to be answered by Professor Mehr, who is a foreign policy expert. I have no idea, to be honest.
I mean, it certainly informs the present. I mean, the questions, as we said at the beginning, of Kurdish nationalism, big issue right now. Questions of the geographic boundaries and the imperial ambitions of Turkey and Iran and Russia are all in conflict there, as they've been for many years. And this is enormously informs of this history. But I say it every opportunity I get. Historians have a lot of trouble predicting the past. We really can't predict the future. This history should inform policy as we look at trying to sort out American interests in these areas. But as Mark Twain is often quoted saying, his history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Yeah. And you just have to keep that in mind, because there's never, history doesn't repeat itself. These events, these rivalries, do not forever establish a pattern that's unchangeable, and yet you're not going to change them without understanding them, and or if you do, you're going to make a bigger mess. You really do need to understand them and pay attention to that as you formulate policy. And I really wish we had. I was confident that we had people who had that sort of depth of knowledge in policy making positions.
It's just one last remark. It's the journey of writing a book is a fascinating journey. And it started with a kind of just personal curiosity. I wanted to read more, understand. Then I found it fascinating. So much has been ignored. And then you read more of the sources which mention Simko. You realize how badly they have covered the man. Simplifying, oversimplifying it, throwing adjectives left and right. Actually, from purely political and ideological point of view, rather than give where the credit is due. This man had a life. It doesn't matter how bad or good or violent, peaceful, but it's a fascinating story. Now that he's gone, instead of using him again as an icon or as a demon, talk about him. Let's see what kind of lessons we can learn from history. And in the end, I was fascinated with the fact that such a, I wouldn't say a major history, but such a historical figure that can teach us so much about the region, about the events, about what has happened there, has been ignored completely in its reality, but has been converted into something for ideological use, which I would call it abuse, in fact. And that, to me, is the greatest disservice. If you're writing history, you should use it as a way of opening, expanding horizons, rather than going back to your own ideological biases and talking about it as if he is what you believe he should be, rather than what he was actually.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have a former colleague, Tunde Adeleke, who wrote a book about Martin Delany, who was a 19th century black nationalist who was largely forgotten until the 1960s when black nationalists adopted him as one of their own. And Tunde, who's a terrific historian, went back and looked at Martin Delany was a black nationalist, but not in the sense that the black nationalists of the 1960s made him out to be, because they were doing exactly what Mehrdad was just describing, making him their own. I mean, as Tunde pointed out, his approach to black nationalism in Africa was deeply rooted in American missionary Christianity. It was deeply rooted in European imperialist ideas. And even though he was a black American, and these ideas influenced, and if you really want to learn something from Delany, study Delany in the context of his time and his environment, and then you may actually learn something. Yeah. But if you go in there with a preset idea of what you want to find, you'll find it, but you won't learn very much.
Yeah, I guess that goes to Burnham's point about drawing from George Sorel about the function of myth and using these myths to direct sort of political and behavior of the population. Wasn't there a quote by Faulkner that you guys stuck in the book?
The past is never dead. It's not even past. It's absolutely true. But if you want to learn anything, I mean, you have to study the past as the past. As a British writer said, the past is another country. They do things differently there.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think in some ways, for me, there is this very clear demarcation between those myth makers. They are looking for mythological, iconic figures so they can use that person for their own ideological or political beliefs. And then the history. History is far more complex, far more messy, and it just gives us a sense that human beings are not angels or demons. They are very complex, filled with contradictions, conflicts, accomplishments, failures, whatever. But that teaches you a great deal. It's very humbling, because you realize that if you ever want to get into a historical figure, you should avoid using general abstract adjectives. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys. You have been listening to a discussion of Professor Mehrdad Kia's book, The Clash of Empires and the Rise of Kurdish Proto-Nationalism, 1905 to 1926, Ismail Agha Simko, and the Campaign for an Independent Kurdish State. In this work, Professor Kia endeavors to correct the historical record regarding the context of Simko's life and his ambitions to establish a Kurdish state. On the one hand, Iranian and British historians portrayed Simko as a bloodthirsty brigand who pillaged defenseless villages in northwestern Iran. On the other hand, Kurdish histories attempted to revive Simko's reputation and present him as a hero of Kurdish nationalism. Some historians in this camp portrayed Simko's revolt as a reaction against the centralization of Iranian rule under Reza Shah. In the introduction to his book, Professor Kia admits that he was initially persuaded by this interpretation, but discloses that he changed his mind after taking a closer look at the primary sources, and it is rare to find a work of history that expresses such a degree of humility. As Professor Kia writes, quote, "My initial reading of secondary sources led me to the erroneous conclusion that Simko's revolt was a direct response to the centralizing policies of the Iranian government. A more in-depth search through primary sources, however, revealed that my initial findings were faulty and deficient." End quote. As Professor Kia pointed out, Simko's rebellion began in 1918, well before the Shah took power in 1925. Therefore, Simko's revolt could not be wholly regarded as a reaction against the Iranian government's actions to centralize its power in the region. Instead of casting Simko as hero or villain, Professor Kia offers a more nuanced story of Simko and Kurdish nationalism. Quote, My objective in writing this book is to analyze the underlying political and historical circumstances that shaped Simko and enabled him to emerge as the leader of the first major Kurdish separatist movement in 20th century Iran. I believe that the Kurdish chief's life and career can provide us with a useful framework to discuss how radical transformations in the immediate periphery of the Kurdish populated region in Iran impelled him to demand an independent state. Through an investigation of Simko's life, Professor Kia attempts to explain the antecedents of Kurdish nationalism that arose out of the power vacuum after the fall of the Russian, Ottoman, and Persian empires following World War I. It is a very well-written book and should be required reading for foreign policy experts who wish to deepen their understanding of the region and expand their knowledge with regard to Kurdish nationalism. These issues are increasingly relevant today as the weakening of the Iranian government and the fall of Assad in Iran both significantly rearranged the balance of power in the region. Consequently, many speculate whether a Kurdish state may arise out of the current chaos in the Middle East. Professor Kia is skeptical of such an outcome. Regardless, his work certainly informs that conversation, and you may find a link to Professor Kia's book in the description below. Professor Kia continues to write on Kurdish nationalism, so please keep your eye out for Professor Kia's upcoming book on the topic, which will be available very soon. If you'd like to learn more from Professor Mehr and Professor Kia, please consider purchasing one of their books, links to which will be provided in the description below. For more of Professor Kia's literally encyclopedic knowledge, consider The Persian Empire, a historical encyclopedia, one of the most comprehensive studies on the topic. In this historical overview, published in 2 volumes and covering a period of nearly 1,500 years, Professor Kia explores the region's rich history while providing insight into the diversity of civilizations and cultures under the influence of the Persian Empire. He also uses sources from the ancient Persians themselves. His historical encyclopedia studies the pre-Islamic civilizations of Iran, from the Caucasus region to the Middle East, Central Asia, and even the Indian subcontinent. Professor Kia also includes over 180 entries and contributions from scholars who analyze the rise and fall of the Persian dynasties. His encyclopedia covers topics such as religion, royal nobility, the caste system, and political assassinations, and offers perspectives from a variety of disciplines, from geography to anthropology, art history, and archaeology, among other disciplines. If you're looking for something a little shorter, consider this fascinating book, Daily Life in the Ottoman Empire, published in 2011, which offers penetrating insights into the pluralistic society and culture of the vast Ottoman Empire, which extended from Budapest in Hungary to Mecca in Arabia. Each chapter presents a profound analysis of a particular aspect of daily life in the Ottoman Empire. For those interested in the history of the 1950s, take a look at the Eisenhower Years, published in 2009 by Professor Mehr, which is nearly 1,000 pages. This compendium offers a thorough summary and analysis of the 1950s and the Eisenhower Presidency. The Eisenhower Years offers a balanced study of the politically charged years of the 1950s, and before scholars like Professor Mehr started taking a closer look into the 1950s, historians did not fully appreciate how tumultuous that decade really was. This book includes numerous biographical entries on key figures of the Eisenhower era, such as Allen W. Dulles, Joe McCarthy, and Rosa Parks, just to name a few, combined with speeches such as the Military-Industrial Complex speech, the Little Rock Address, the Eisenhower Doctrine, Eisenhower speech after the Soviet launch of Sputnik, and gives an in-depth look into the executive actions of the Eisenhower administration. And for you teachers out there, Professor Mehr also authored this Instructor's Manual, which is an extremely helpful guide for anyone teaching American history. The Instructor's Manual covers more than 500 years of American history, from Columbus and the discovery of America to the administration of George W. Bush and the contentious election of 2004. The manual also provides passages from key documents, points of mastery that students should be able to explain, and interesting questions for discussion. And be sure to tune in to Professor Kia and Professor Mehr's radio show, hosted by Peter Christian, the man with the golden voice, on Missoula's KGVO radio station, 98.3 FM and 1290 AM. You can also tune into the radio show through the KGVO website or the brand new KGVO app. The show airs every first Tuesday and third Monday of each month from 8:30 to 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. On the first Tuesdays of each month, the professors cover global hotspots, and on the third Mondays of each month, The professors lead a discussion on the monthly KGVO book club. What's more, you can call in and submit your questions and comments to the good professors to hear their thoughts on current events, geopolitics, the book of the month, and much more. It's an excellent radio show. People tune in from all over the country, and perhaps even more exciting, some people actually read the book for the book of the month. You can also find recordings of the radio show on YouTube and Facebook and the KGVO app, links to which will be provided in the description below. Or you can simply search on your browser for KGVO Missoula Book Club or KGVO Missoula Global Hotspots. This has been the Mike and Mehrdad Show. Thanks for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next time.